we'll have a silent prayer to begin. Amen. It's a little hard to know what to say in one standalone presentation.
Yeah. Saan tartong nag-uipis? Tatapa. Oy.
So I'm not going to try and go too far. I'll try and just do something condensed that we can have as standing alone. Something that was said at the last camp meeting. I'm going to continue to bring up this point in the future. When we started discussing two streams of information in 2018, there was two issues in the movement. One, most of the movement was looking at the wrong stream of information. And the second problem, most of the leadership didn't even believe we should be looking at external information. They saw external journalism as dangerous. Especially the present. We had to fight both of those errors when we began to speak about two streams of information. I did the painful and unthinkable for me. I went back and listened to myself. The last presentation of the last camp meeting. Where we took the position as a movement that understanding LGBT issues biblically we accepted them as LGBT within the movement. Not just as members, but the freedom to live LGBT in the eyes of God and his movement. Practicing LGBT. gay marriage, not just in the civil wedding, but the religious. I wanted to remember the wording that I used. But one thing stood out for me even stronger as I watched. The power of the formalization is not in that last presentation. The real power was in everything that built up to that point. The last 3 years, we could argue. Then we could argue the last 2 years. The last 32 years. The last 18 months. Or just the camp meeting itself. That's where the power came from. Within Adventism, there is conservative and liberal. I tackled head-on the mindset and position that conservative Adventism takes to LGBT issues. But Elder Parminder dismantled the best that liberalism has to offer. So I spoke to the conservatives and Elder Parminder spoke to the liberals. Because the best that liberal Adventism can offer to understand this subject is either throwaway inspiration or live a pained and lonely life with celibacy. And the reason that this movement is able to avoid both ditches because under God's leading, He has led us to understand parable methodology. And the weight and importance of history. On one side of the board, we drew 1989 to present. We addressed methodology and the reform line. The parable that gay marriage has been since 1989. And all that Cana and the other reform lines tell us of our history. On the other side of the board, we laid out about 2,500 years. And saw the homophobia that has come not from Christianity, but it existed all through that history as a relic of paganism. Then when you combine methodology and history, so much opens up. So we could say two streams of information. What is the stream? What are both streams? I would argue they're both not just a source, but journalism. People use Twitter as a source. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. We've been talking journalism. That's what we see in 1996 formalised. I thought today, for the short time we have, considering the date, I've become aware how little as a movement we understand the history of Islam. So I just want to go through history. And in doing that, I want to make just a few points about two streams of information. That will probably continue on at a later date. So I want to discuss not all of Islamic history, of course, but the key points that led us to 9/11, and the war with radical Islam that extended particularly to 2019. We're going to pick it up in the 1700s. I've been asked to write the names. Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab. The translators will speak to me after the presentation, I can tell. He lived from 1703 to 1792. So this is a man from the 1700s. He became very influential, very controversial. He sought to revive and purify Islam from what he perceived as non-Islamic popular religious beliefs and practices by returning to what he believed were the fundamental principles of the Islamic religion. This should be the top of your notes. So 1700s, he says we're going to purify Islam. Seventeen hundreds, he says they're going to purify Islam. And in his main theological treatise, he presents a strong anti-Christian and anti-Judaic stance. He saw it as his mission to restore a more pure and original form of the faith of Islam, and he advocated for a literalist interpretation of the Quran and its laws. So there are two branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia. Within Sunni, there's about 4 schools of thought. One of these is Wahhabism. It developed from this man. And it is the most radical and the most conservative. Now, this was not particularly popular. He was rejected by his father and his brother. He was expelled from his territory. And when he was expelled, someone invited him and said, "Come to my territory." The ruler of Daria. So the ruler of Daria tells Wahhab, "Come live with me." And that ruler was Muhammad bin Saud. Now, 1700s, who is Muhammad bin Saud? Why is this called the Saudi Arabian Peninsula? It's because it's ruled by the House of Saud. It would be like calling Australia the island of Lambert. It's the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. It's named after one family. So in the 1700s, it was actually 1744. These two men went into an agreement. And Muhammad bin Saud said, "I'll take care of the government. you, Wahhab, take care of the religion, and will govern the secular government and the religion of this peninsula. It's been a power sharing arrangement and has remained in place for nearly 300 years. This is what gave the House of Saud so much religious legitimacy. So there was this political religious alliance, and the House of Saud had both successes and failures. And when in the 1930s, they've had this alliance with Wahhabist nomadic militias. They finally achieved full success. And they set up the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Run by the House of Saud. But this has been a 300-year religious and political alliance that's enabled this. And I'll remind you, Wahhabism was not a dominant sect of Islam. So the House of Saud has some problems. They want to run this peninsula and in this peninsula is Mecca and Medina. The two holiest sites of Islam. Roughly there. Mecca and Medina. So the problem this royal family has is they belong to this little minority group of Islam. And they know that all of these other Muslims are going to say, what have you little Wahhabi small sect, what right do you have to rule the holy sites? Quoting from our document for the translators. This is from the conversation. Quote 4. It's titled, Explainer, what is Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia? Central to the Saudis' military and political success was their renewed alliance with pro-Wahhabi nomadic militias, known literally as the Brotherhood. Ever since, Wahhabi ideology has been central to the survival and legitimacy of the state of Al Saud. From roughly the 1950s on, the Wahhabi ulama, their Islamic scholars, were increasingly co-opted by the House of Al Saud to provide religious legitimacy as it tightened its grip on power against tribal rivals and consolidated Saudi Arabian nationalism as opposed to Nazarite pan-Arabism. So they know that to legitimize their rule of the holy sites, they needed to use religion. Show that they were the true and pure branch of Islam. This process of legitimization included Wahhabi policing of the Sharia-based legal systems and education. And a whole lot of discrimination against women. Then they encounter another turning point. In 1938, 6 years after they take power, an oil well in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, drilled into what would soon be identified as the largest source of petroleum in the world. Now comes the dilemma that is Saudi Arabia. Incredibly conservative, needing to legitimize their rule by spreading that Wahhabi branch. But where are they going to sell the oil? This is going to go to the West. So this extremely conservative government, new nation, is all of a sudden extremely wealthy and closely beginning to work and interact with the West. From the 1930s to the 1970s, they're spreading Wahhabism. Then 1979 comes. Now, we know 1979 from Afghanistan. We know that begins a 10-year war. Proxy war of the Cold War. Which leads to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. So we know that over here in Afghanistan there's a civil war developing. But this is only one of 4 things happening in 1979. That changes the Islamic world. Another is Pakistan. It had been an incredibly progressive country. And then someone comes in and overthrows that and brings in Sharia law. It's awful to read the first-hand accounts of the women that went through that. So that's happening in 1978, 1979. We know what happens in Iran. That overthrow of the government, and then they have this radical Shia. That becomes an extremely oppressive church-state union. But I want us to talk about Saudi Arabia in 1979. See, Saudi Arabia had been spreading this radical Wahhabist conservatism. But the problem, the dilemma has been they don't live up to it. The royal family, kind of like Donald Trump, don't live up to what they preach religiously. The very people they've been proselytizing turn on them. In 1979, there was a siege in Mecca. In a stunning strike, a band of 500 Saudi extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca for 2 weeks, publicly calling Saudi rulers puppets of the West and traitors to true Islam. So the leader of the attack says that the House of Saud has lost its legitimacy. They were corrupt, they loved money. They were bringing in the West. So what the House of Saud has feared all along happened in 1979. Where conservative Islamists said, you, this family, have no right to rule Mecca and Medina. It took them 2 weeks, but they finally overran and freed the Grand Mosque. Hundreds of people died. The mosque was full when the siege began. So what do they do now to prove to everyone they are the legitimate rulers? They need to show Wahhabism in the state. And they need to export it. They began by banning photographs of women in newspapers. Taking women off television. Changing all their school curriculum. So because of the threat to their legitimacy in 1979, the House of Saud, with renewed fervour, are intent on spreading Wahhabism. Showing themselves as the true and the pure sect. One of the things they do in the 1980s is confiscate the Quran. And the government sets up all of these printing presses. They construct their own version of the Quran. Which is the Quran with all Wahhabi commentary. It's like if we printed, if we took all the Bibles off Adventists and then printed our own Bible with our own movement commentary. Then they translated into English. At the height, they were printing 8 million copies a year. And then they flooded the world with this amended Quran. That had Wahhabi commentary. Remember, a few decades ago, this was a minority sect. And a very conservative, radical one. So one passage in the Quran that's addressing Allah says, those who earned your anger. Then in brackets, the Wahhabi commentary. They've added in such as the Jews. Nor of those who went astray. Now in brackets. Such as the Christians. And this has become the dominant Quran today. So there's a lot of effort that they've put in different avenues to legitimize their rule. But the key point was given to them with the Afghanistan war. A relative progressive country, Pakistan, I won't give his full name, he's just known as Zia. He takes over Pakistan in 1978. He brings in Sharia law. And for the women that lived through that, if you hear their stories, it's just really sad. To see the human rights that they had developed through that country for women just crumble in a day. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Pakistan sees that as a threat. Partly because of this oil arrangement, Saudi Arabia is already allied to the United States. And they form a three-way alliance. Saudi Arabia, United States, Pakistan. Towards this end of the Cold War, the United States spent about $8 billion ensuring the Soviet Union lost that war. The Saudi Arabia matched that. So Saudi Arabia spent about $8 billion on this war as well. Because they saw it another opportunity too. Spread Wahhabism. Islamic fighters to kick out the Soviet Union had descended on this country from all corners. Tens of thousands of Muslims descended on Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. From all over the Middle East, they flooded here to kick out the Soviet Union. Now, if you want to spread a message, this was a good opportunity. They'd fly into Pakistan, and the Saudi Arabia began offering large discounts for anyone that wanted to fly to Pakistan. Now, the capital of Pakistan is about here. Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, is about here. If you know about the Khyber Pass, that's about here. And there's this town here called Peshawar. And this town becomes pretty much the petri dish where everything future is going to develop. All along this border with Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia sets up hundreds of Islamic schools or colleges. Hundreds of religious seminaries. Just across the border from Afghanistan, for all the fighters that have descended from all across the world, they sent their most radical Wahhabi clerics and what you had was mass radical indoctrination. Some of the graduates of these schools became the founders of the Taliban. And out of these schools would rise the fighters for Al-Qaeda. In Peshawar, there is a man, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. He is known as the father of global jihad. A Palestinian Sunni Islamic scholar. He preached both defensive and offensive jihad by Muslims. He settled in this hotspot, and he messaged a friend of his and said, "Come join me in Peshawar." There's big things happening here. That friend who pulled into Peshawar was Osama bin Laden. In 1988, bin Laden created a group called the Base, Al-Qaeda. He went to Afghanistan in 1979. He joined Yusuf Azam in Peshawar in, I think it was 1986. In 1988, he formed the Base, Al-Qaeda. 1989, that war ends and the Soviet Union withdraws. Which means where are all the fighters going? With all they learnt in the theological seminaries Saudi Arabia set up. They go home. And Osama bin Laden heads back to Saudi Arabia in 1989. Determined to turn what he started here into a global network. Now, in this history, there's another issue happening. 80 to 88. And this is the Iran-Iraq war. They've been fighting a brutal war over this border. From 1980 to 1988. Because Iraq is unhappy with its neighbours, and the debts it's incurred because of that war, we've talked at length before about how they invaded Kuwait. Beginning the Gulf War. Now, this aggressive behaviour by Iraq was unsettling for Saudi Arabia. They thought Iraq would turn on them as well. So Osama bin Laden sees his chance. And he tells the House of Saud, your country needs protection. I have all of these wonderful fighters. Trained in the mountains of Afghanistan. Conservative, strict Wahhabi Muslims. Let me bring in my fighters and we will protect Saudi Arabia from Iraq. But remember this dilemma that the House of Saud has. They need that radicalism to justify their leadership. But they're also scared of it. Allied to the West, and in the personal lives of the royal family, not living up to what they preach. So the House of Saud says to Osama bin Laden, thank you, but no thanks. We'll have the United States put their troops on our soil and protect us. And how does that go over with Osama bin Laden? Rejection by his own Wahhabi government in favor of the United States. This is an article by The Atlantic called The 20 Years' War. It's written in 2016. Talking about Osama bin Laden, it says the following. His central lament was the presence of US forces in Saudi Arabia or the occupation of the land of the two holiest sites. Following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, bin Laden had offered to defend Saudi Arabia with his Arab Legion, but the Saudi royals decided that the US military would be a better bet. he ended up having to leave Saudi Arabia because he was no longer welcome there. So something else is happening in 1989. Another name. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He arrived in Afghanistan in 1989, landing in Peshawar. And it was here in 1989 he was converted to radical Islam. He had not been before. And he and Osama bin Laden know each other. They don't get along. Osama bin Laden is a well-educated and wealthy Saudi. Al-Zarqawi is the opposite. It's from Jordan. Semi-literate. He's described as a former street thug. He's described as a former street thug. It was rough. And he is converted in 1989. Or within this context in Peshawar. By 1996, both of them, Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi, are in Afghanistan. And in 1996, Osama bin Laden declares war on the United States. I'm not trying to trim through all the waymarks. We're going to go quickly. He has a number of. His primary one is the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia. So these two men are both within Afghanistan in 1996. And to shorten the story, out of Osama bin Laden develops Al-Qaeda. Out of al-Zarqawi develops ISIS. You can't call it ISIS. It's just we'll need that acronym later. Osama bin Laden decides that what he needs to do is attack on American soil. So in 2001, nearly 3,000 men, women, and children are slaughtered. The United States invades Afghanistan. They're trying to hunt him down. He flees into Pakistan and hides. al-Zarqawi flees into Iraq. So one flees to Pakistan and one flees to Iraq. Remember, they know each other, they don't really get along. Al-Zarqawi kind of wants to start his own group. So in 2003, the United States wants to invade Iraq. They need a pretext to do that. They want the United Nations to support them. So they send their most trusted diplomat to the United Nations, Colin Powell. And what Colin Powell needs to prove to the UN is that he can connect Iraq to Osama bin Laden. And how is he going to do that? He's going to say the connecting link is al-Zarqawi. His evidence is that al-Zarqawi fled to Iraq. Like much of what the US did then, that wasn't actually technically true. Al-Zarqawi fled to a remote and lawless part of Iraq. He was not known, protected by Saddam Hussein. But for the United States at the UN, he becomes their connecting link. And therefore, at that moment, also becomes quite famous. Then the United States invades Iraq anyway. They topple Saddam Hussein. They then do something that many people believe was their biggest mistake. And they essentially fire the entire Iraqi army. And Iraq is mostly Sunni. So you have this angry Sunni army all of a sudden out of a job with nowhere to go. And no leadership. So where will they go? Well, al-Zarqawi was ready. He and a number of other people brought in these soldiers and in 2004 he formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So first of all, he was just kind of on his own, doing his own thing. But the US have been fighting Al-Qaeda for about 3 years now. And Al-Qaeda is very weakened. It's a little bit more complicated. There's quite a number of leaders in Iraq taking in all of these soldiers into these extremist groups. But al-Zarqawi was known as the most extreme and the most brutal. So he has developed a name for himself above all the other leaders. And Al-Qaeda over here, feeling the pressure of the US resistance, even though there has been this tension, this dislike between the two men and the two groups, and kind of like McDonald's or a supermarket chain, they reach out to al-Zarqawi and say, we'll support you, come under our Al-Qaeda banner. And he agrees. So in 2004, he names his branch Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. All of that is suppressed by the United States war effort. And he ends up being killed by a US airstrike. So from 2004 to 2011, they're not having a lot of success. But then in 2011, the Arab Spring sparked the beginning of the Syrian civil war. So Assad is a brutal dictator. You have Assad and the rebels. Now, for most Western countries, and a lot of others, it's kind of easy. Good guy, bad guy. Sorry, bad guy, good guy. Assad, bad guy, rebels were the good guys. So it seemed simple. So Assad says, I'll make this harder. I'll make it hard for these countries that claim to believe in civil rights to support the rebels. So what he deliberately does is empty Syria's prisons. He knows when he empties the prisons, the most radical, extremist, violent prisoners quite a number of terrorists, they're going to flood into the rebels. And he deliberately orchestrates that to make it harder for Western nations to support the rebel groups. So all of a sudden, there's all of these rebel groups formed, many of them filled with former prisoners. Now remember, al-Zarqawi is dead. Al-Qaeda in Iraq is quite shrunk and struggling. But they've shed Al-Qaeda and they have now called themselves the Islamic State in Iraq. So they went from al-Zarqawi, 1989, forms his own rebel groups, goes into an alliance with Al-Qaeda and becomes Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They have a new leader, just prior to the Arab Spring, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They shed their connection to Al-Qaeda, call themselves the Islamic State in Iraq, with the Syrian civil war area opens up for them. They absorbed many of Assad's freed prisoners in the rebel groups. And renamed themselves now the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS. What I want us to be able to do is trace how it developed. I won't go a lot into the history past this. I believe ISIS really forms around 2012. Declare a caliphate in mid-2014. In 2014 was ISIS at its height of power. But the end of 2014 also saw the turning point. This is known as the Siege of Kobani. So while it is at them as a caliphate at their height, in December begins a fight over the city of Kobani. They initially win, but then they begin to lose that in early 2015. Under the pressure of the United States. And from 2015 to 2019, they're gradually pushed out. But in the time period of their height, they carved out a state the size of the United Kingdom. In 2019, Baghdadi is killed. And they lose the last of their land. What I wanted us to be able to do was trace the history. You can go right back to Wahhabism. This was not mainstream Islam. But it was taken on and spread in Saudi Arabia by Saudi Arabia. Exported to the Muslim world and beyond. As the need to legitimize their government. There is an article in the New York Times from 2016. I think it's number 8 in your document. It's called Saudis and Extremism, both the arsonists and the firefighters. It describes this tension within Saudi Arabia. They are under threat by these radical Islamic groups. By the fires they actually set in the first place. And this is one theory around 9/11 that is not a theory. That the country that George Bush did not want to touch was his ally. And it was his ally that was primarily responsible. All but a few of the terrorists were Saudi Arabian. It's the minority sect of Islam that Saudi Arabia sent mainstream. And all across the world, thousands of mosques, sending out their own clerics. It was organized. But what Saudi Arabia has never been able to do what that family has never been able to do is control it. So they end up suffering under the fires that they lit. We don't have time to go through that article because I want to make another point before we close. So tomorrow I'll put it out on the media broadcast. I'll just read these 2 quotes. Saudi leaders seek good relations with the West and see jihadist violence as a menace that could endanger their rule, especially now that the Islamic State is staging attacks in the kingdom, 25 attacks in the last 8 months by the government's account. But they are also driven by their rivalry with Iran, and they depend for legitimacy on a clerical establishment dedicated to a reactionary set of beliefs. Those conflicting goals can play out in a bafflingly inconsistent manner. There is a broad consensus that the Saudi ideological juggernaut has disrupted local Islamic traditions in dozens of countries, the result of lavish spending on religious outreach for half a century, estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. So I've got a few seconds to make a controversial point. I want to go to an article in The Atlantic that was written in 2013. It's titled, "Stop Blaming Colonial Borders for the Middle East's Problems." Don't know how many people in the movement are aware of Jon Stewart and John Oliver. In the left-wing branch of the United States, they are famous comedians, but they are most famous for how they understand and present political subjects through comedy. And both Jon Stewart and John Oliver are extremely influential. Jon Stewart running The Daily Show from the 1990s. And through comedy on The Daily Show, he battled Fox News weekly. So you have Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. And John Oliver got known by working with him on that show. And in 2013, they did this political act that was meant to be funny. John Oliver dressed up as a 19th century British explorer. And with sarcasm saying to Jon Stewart, "There's nothing the Arab respects more, John, than a strong, steady white hand drawing arbitrary lines betwixt their ridiculous tribal alliances." Recently, The Daily Show joined the growing consensus of commentators declaring that arbitrary, carelessly drawn imperial borders are to blame for all that's wrong with the Middle East today. In doing so, they demonstrated that it's easy to be incredibly funny and dangerously wrong at the same time. There's plenty to criticise about the legacy of colonialism, but dwelling on colonial borders only increases the risk that our future interventions in the region will further undermine its already fragile states. The idea that better borders, drawn with careful attention to the region's ethnic and religious diversity, would have spared the Middle East a century's worth of violence is especially provocative at a moment when Western powers weigh the merits of intervention in the region. Unfortunately, this critique overstates how arbitrary today's Middle East borders really are, overlooks how arbitrary every other border in the world is, implies that better borders were possible, and ignores the cynical imperial practices that actually did sow conflict in the region. I'll skip a little of the next paragraph where it talks about Ottoman boundaries and Mesopotamia. Starting from the word meanwhile, about 7 lines down. Meanwhile, the fact that Iraq's eastern border with Iran, this border here. Meanwhile, the fact that Iraq's eastern border with Iran followed a line set by the 16th century conquests of Solomon the Magnificent didn't prevent the two countries from fighting a decade-long conflict over it that killed 10 times more people than all the Arab-Israeli wars combined. It's this border that killed 10 times more people than the Arab-Israeli wars combined. "400 years old and was set by Solomon the Magnificent." To the west, Mount Lebanon had been carved out as a special administrative unit following religious violence there in 1860 as a compromise between Istanbul and the great powers. That this region should nonetheless belong to Syria was perhaps one of the Assad regime's least controversial positions over the years. The only country in the area for which no ancient borders existed was Jordan. It was formed in 1922 from some not too desirable bits of arid land as something for Britain's ally Abdullah to be king of. Like most kings, he would have liked something bigger, and yet under his family's rule, Jordan has been spared much of the turmoil endured by its less artificial neighbours. I'll skip the next two paragraphs for time, but they're all relevant. So they say, what if the British and French had created one big Arab state? Any such state would still have faced difficulty with its Christian, Kurdish, and Shiite minorities, and with Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia all asserting their own claims to preeminence in the Arab world, the question of leadership would have been contentious. Most appealing, perhaps, is the idea that things might have gone smoother if the Europeans had just left the region's inhabitants to sort things out themselves. This is what happened in the Balkans, where local leaders drew their own borders and the fighting lasted up through the 1990s. I'll skip the next paragraph that goes into Africa and Sudan. The fundamental problem was, and still is, that the world doesn't have any authentic or natural borders, just waiting to be identified and transcribed onto a map. Europe's real borders owe their current legitimacy, such as it is, to continent-wide exhaustion following several centuries of fighting. Winston Churchill may have drawn the border between Iraq and Jordan with a pen, but he was just as central in delineating the border between France and Germany when he led the Allies to victory in World War II. Determining whether Alsace and Lorraine would be French or German was never as simple as just sending a commission to find out where the French people stopped and the German people started. Rather, the territory was awarded as a prize following each of Europe's bloody conflicts. Similarly, no commission, no matter the good intentions, could have been expected to find the magic line that got all the Sunnis on one side, the Shiites on the other, and the oil right in the middle. So what happens then if you work around ethnic groups and create them precise? I'll skip the next paragraph, but it discusses what the Soviet Union did in Central Asia. It didn't, in short, it didn't work. In the last two paragraphs, he discusses what the real problem is. It's not colonial borders. If you think borders are a problem, look to Europe and 2 world wars. They're always messy. Winston Churchill drew theirs as well as some in the Middle East. And he says that drawing attention to the wrong problem distracts from the real problem, which has been alliances. I also post this on the media broadcast. So I wanted 2 points from today's study. First point, we have to understand history correctly. When we don't understand history correctly, we twist and form a wrong worldview. And prior to the message of 2 streams of information, so many people in the movement just used fast brain thinking to accept any theory that came their way that fit with their ideological belief. This is 2 streams of journalism. There is the danger in the movement that we continue with fast brain thinking fed off comedians, social media, YouTube.
Social media.
Social media influencers.
Social media, social media, no?
And snappy memes.
And who do be a
meme, it's okay. Things that agree with our worldview because they seem left-wing. If you say, well, if they make some mistakes, what's the harm? And I'm saying there is a harm. It's frankly dangerous for everything you imbibe and the work you're meant to do in a couple months' time. Whatever date Panium is. Don't read into that. The minute we twist the story to agree with our narrative, we're in danger. And the message of 2 streams was never to turn people to the sources of information I see shared prolifically today. Our sources must be journalistic. Thought out and thorough. Thorough. It's okay. I'm closing. I know people have been sharing an article, and I'm not saying it's a bad article. But people are forming the position that the United States is to blame for all this, and frankly, it's not. I understand the danger that right-wing terrorism has in the United States today. But when ISIS launched 25 terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia in 8 months, do you think they launched 25 in Saudi Arabia and none in the United States because they gave up hating the United States? No. It's because the United States took precautions against Islamic terrorism. When we form these arguments, somewhere down the road, we end up doing the following. Making excuses for religions and cultures that are oppressive and sexist. Quite a while ago, back in really early 2020 time period, someone wrote on Facebook, if it wasn't for the West, all of Africa would be successful democracies. Frankly, I don't agree. So much gets weaponized now to defend against sexism. And frankly, the left buys into it quite often. I am happy that there is a Muslim woman in Congress. That Mitch McConnell has to look at every day. I'm quite proud of her and I'm happy about it. But I also want to see these women freed. Just the way I would want a Mennonite woman to take off her head covering. We can only speak straight about universal human rights and women's rights and LGBT issues across the world if we understand the world correctly. We can only understand the world correctly if we are painfully careful with our sources. What happened September 11, 2001 the men, women and children that died in a couple of hours let's call it what it is. It's truly awful. And that extremism has not gone away. And the United States has made terrible mistakes. Including mistakes that impinge on universal human rights. But we cannot let that distract from a correct perspective. The oppression that has also grown up and spread within religion and culture. And whenever we encounter it, inside and outside of this movement, there is no excuse. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord, so close to the end of our reform line, we're meant to be servants, teachers, priests. Lord, any chance to still prepare. May there not be laziness or lethargy. May we all see our personal need to form a correct perspective so that we can be of use. I pray that you will bless your people, many of them still in the Sabbath hours. Elder Palminder, as he's soon to present. And all across the world as they remember this date. And the few moments that brought such destruction. I pray, Lord, the world might awaken. Beginning with Adventism. Will they see the hope in the methodology of this movement? See beauty in what we teach. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for bearing with me.